Section 1 of the Early Tudors, Henry VII and Henry VIII. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D. The Early Tudors, Henry VII and Henry VIII, by Charles Edward Moberly. Chapter 1. The Growth of Despotism in Europe during the 15th century. For those who, like ourselves, are trained under free institutions, it is hard to realize that great nations are generally those which have been long under the stern discipline of a despotism at last shaken off. Yet it cannot be denied that this form of government, extending over the whole of a large country and ruling all things within it, has been more able than any other to create a strong sense of nationality overpowering narrow local differences, to establish thorough internal security, and to direct the people to enterprises requiring great exertion in the general cause and leading to strong enthusiasms, whether through defeat or victory. It has been mostly when their energies have been thus guided that nations have forgotten the jealousies of province against province, county against county, district against district, and learned that the members of one state are immeasurably nearer to one another than any foreigner can be. And when this feeling for the first time gains strength, and a great nation is brought to feel its own unity, how many important consequences spring from the change! A people which has been thus ruled, if only the despotism does not last long enough to break its spirit, is sure to feel intensely. Loyalty to the power which has made it one becomes a passion, sometimes even a madness. Bravery makes no account of its own life or of other men's. Self-devotion prevails in many of its most striking forms. High-spirited men become proud of laying down their freedom at the feet of a master who gives them in exchange for it the prospect of ruling over their fellow-men as his deputies. In such times we must not indeed expect to find justice, humanity, and peacefulness, or even truth and honour as now understood. These are plants which spring only from the soil of freedom. But we can say that the national mind, in order that it may sometime feel truth and right strongly, is at any rate learning to feel something strongly. That something may be and often is perverse. Indeed, it is with the people as with the child, in whom we tolerate a certain violence and misdirection of will, because we know that such strength is the very seed-bed of future excellence, and that no one can be really great of whom we cannot say that quicquid volet, valde volet. Such, then, is on the whole the meaning of those who say that few nations become really great without having been under despotism for a time. In this sense, eminent Italian politicians, even of the present day, sometimes hold to Machiavelli's opinion, that it is the greatest of national misfortunes to their countrymen never to have been welded together by passing through this stage, and far-seeing thinkers among ourselves have considered the present constitution of Russia not unfavourable to her chance of being great at last, seeing that despotism has certainly built up her unity and inspired her with the spirit of obedience and self-sacrifice, without hitherto breaking down the energy which will some time achieve her political freedom. Whether the history of England from the 16th century onwards proves the truth of this theory will be best settled when we have gone through it. It is plain enough, at any rate, that a despotism did establish itself under the Tudors, and that many of the qualities likely to characterize a nation thus governed did in fact show themselves in Englishmen. We do, as a matter of fact, see them proud of their national unity, bearing themselves haughtily towards foreigners, immoderately fond of aggressive expeditions, recklessly brave, deeply and sometimes even insanely loyal. The object of this work is to trace the rise of the autocracy which had these effects, and as the history of England is seldom or never so cut off from that of the Continent as to have nothing in common with what goes on there at the same time, it will be well, by way of introduction, to show that increasing despotism was in the 15th century the law, so to speak, of advance in the countries of Western Europe. Thus we shall presently be enabled to see what changes among ourselves sprang from direct imitation of our neighbours, and what others arose from causes of a general character affecting all countries alike. Spain, as might be expected from the mixture of Eastern blood in her people and the military type of her civilization, had been first to enter upon the course of absolutism, which for a time raised her power to such a portentous height, and then laid it prostrate. Indeed, her feuds of the Trastamare family had been as effective as our Wars of the Roses 100 years later in clearing off the turbulent nobles, and thus enabling the crown of Castile to strengthen itself by the help of the commons. Under the young Henry III, 1390, the husband of Catherine of Lancaster, the Third Estate was in remarkable prosperity. Commerce and manufactures improved greatly, and the history of the country might have been different but for Henry's death in 1406 at the early age of 28. He was succeeded by his son John II, whose reign of 48 years was little else than a perpetual conspiracy against his subjects' freedom. Aided by his imperious minister Alvaro de Luna, he excluded from the royal council the deputies of the commons, raised taxes without legislative sanction, and issued pragmaticus, asserting his own right to make laws for his subjects. When opposition to these arbitrary measures was threatened, he devised and carried out successfully a wicked scheme for dividing the popular party. Some of the towns were induced first to petition that they might defray the expenses of their deputies during the session of the Cortes, and then, with a surprising want of political foresight, to allow them to be excused attendance altogether, in order to save the same charges. Thus, after a while, only 18 towns sent deputies, the rest being obliged to entrust their interests to these. So successfully were the seeds of division thus sown, that in 1506, when some of the excluded towns wished to have their ancient rights back, they were vigorously opposed by the privileged cities, which maintained that the right of representation was theirs alone. The policy of John II was followed by Henry IV, Isabella of Castile's elder brother, who also threw the trade of the country into utter disorder by debasing the coinage, besides demoralizing society by his own bad example. Isabella herself, on her accession in 1474, resolved to resume the old policy of relying on the commons, to which she was the more inclined from her earnest desire to benefit the people which she ruled. By decrees obtained from the courts of justice, she wrested from the nobles many of the estates, annuities, and other grants which they had unconstitutionally got from her predecessors. Besides this, both she and her husband Ferdinand, King of Aragon, employed men of humble birth in posts which had been always held by nobles. Above all, she adopted and placed under the patronage of the crown the Holy Hermandad, an association of the towns for the repression of violence, using it, in defiance of the nobles, as a national police which she could entirely trust. It must not for a moment be thought that her patronage of the people aimed in the least at restoring their ancient liberties. On the contrary, by establishing and enthusiastically supporting the Inquisition in her dominions, Isabella made any return to constitutional methods impossible, besides deeply staining her own character for honour, patriotism, and humanity. Satisfied with making the towns prosper materially, and with using their support against the grandees, She never foresaw that they would so soon be trying to wrest from her grandson by force of arms the liberty which she denied them. Few passages of history are sadder than the account of their rebellion against the young Charles V. in 1520, when, amidst a host of quite rational petitions for the better conduct of justice, for the relief of taxation, for a native administration, for the abolition of all privileges obtained at the expense of the commons, for the reform of the Cortes, and for sessions once in 3 years at least, they still, short-sighted like their fathers, demanded that the estates of the nobles should be reannexed to the crown, as if they wished to destroy all barriers against despotism except their own. Accordingly, when their forces were beaten on the fatal field of Villars, and their leaders sent to execution by Charles's ministers, the mainspring of popular freedom in Spain was broken, and they entered upon a long period of decay which has not closed even now, and which hardly required that Philip II. Should ensure it by destroying, as he did in 1592, the last fragments of real power possessed by the Cortes, both in Castile and in Aragon. These changes were the more melancholy because Spain had in her old institutions a thoroughly good foundation for rational freedom. Her Cortes dated from 200 years before the time of Simon de Montfort, and had the completest control over state affairs. The accession of each fresh sovereign required their sanction, and they exercised most fully those powers of remonstrating against grievances and of voting supplies, which have always been the two pivots of English freedom. In one point they went beyond us, for their petitions, if accepted by the king, had at once the force of law. In Aragon, where the ancient liberties were even stronger than in Castile, the Justicia judged officially and of right whether the king's letters were genuine and his acts constitutional, while the acknowledged privileges of the kingdom acted as Magna Carta did among ourselves. Catalonia and Valencia, again, had all the free spirit which goes with maritime enterprise. Here the traders were often knights, all being held equal within the mercantile guilds, and the sons of merchants valued as high as those of noblemen, if hostages were required in war. No cause less baleful than the bigotry which created the Inquisition could have destroyed such safeguards, and the high hopes which might have been founded on them. Before the end of the 15th century, a similar struggle with the nobles in France had also ended in favour of the crown. Yet no sovereign could have been weaker than Louis XI at his accession in 1461, and when 4 years later his nobles began the war of the bien public against him. He was surrounded by great feudatories, all of whom he had offended bitterly. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, held in France Burgundy proper, with Artois and Franche-Comté. Beyond it, Brabant, Limburg, Hainaut, and the wealthy cities of Flanders, and was on the point of excluding France from all communication with the rest of Europe, except through his states, by seizing the Provençal dominions of René of Anjou. The Dukes of Bretagne and Bourbon, and the Count of Armagnac, with his Gascons, were equally opposed to Louis, and there was not one of these potentates who would have scrupled for a moment to call in against him the English or any other foreigners. In spite of all this, he succeeded by unresting vigilance and craft in baffling them one by one, and in establishing his own power on the ruin of theirs. On the other hand, the Commons were with him, and favour to them was a ruling principle of his reign. He was never tired of encouraging trade, as when he founded the silk manufacture in France, or of increasing the privileges of the cities. As his reign advanced and enemy after enemy fell before him, agriculture flourished more and more from the ever-increasing security of the country. His taxation was heavy, for he bought off such enemies as Edward IV instead of fighting them. Yet, in spite of Commynes' invidious comparison between his revenue of 4,700,000 francs and the 1,800,000 paid under his father Charles VII., there is no appearance that his imposts were considered excessive in his lifetime. Such were some of the points marking his government of the masses. He was, to the best of his knowledge, a supporter of the low against the high. Yet all that he tried to do on their behalf was more than counterbalanced by his masterful administration. Other kings had fitfully claimed a right to collect taxes by their sole authority. Precedents to that effect had been common in the reigns of John, Charles V., Charles VI., and Charles VII. But Louis, all through his long reign of 22 years, never raised money in any other way, and thus made his people forget the very notion of freedom. For though isolated thinkers like Philippe de Comines still held that a king who levies money unconstitutionally is tyrannous and violent, and that as long as he does so he will never be really strong, the States General had altogether forgotten such ideas when they assembled at Tours after Louis's death to provide for the regency. Although they took at first a high tone and claimed the abolition of the taille and other arbitrary taxes, they still allowed themselves to be worsted by a manoeuvre of the court, and granted the new king the right to levy the taxes of Charles VII., with an addition of 25%. Their stipulation that this power should be treated as a concession of their own, and lasted for only 2 years, after which the states were to be assembled again, hardly looks like a serious attempt at freedom, when we remember that a French king could get his revenue from the provincial councils much more easily than he could from the States General, and was therefore most unwilling to summon the latter, at the risk of remonstrances against every act of his government and every detail of his household arrangements. Thus Louis XI, from the success with which he organized a system of arbitrary taxation, and established it by means of his personal popularity, must needs be considered as one of the great overthrowers of liberty in France. As to other points of administration, it is almost superfluous to remark how absolute he was. No purely patriotic care for his subjects' welfare can be ascribed to the king, who had men tried before judges who were to have their property if they were found guilty, nor can he be considered tender of their lives, who ordered his guards to shoot down everyone who came near his palace walls before a stated hour in the morning, or of their personal freedom, who enclosed them at pleasure in iron cages. We must therefore ascribe his care for commerce and the towns to the absolute necessity under which he lay of finding popular support against his too powerful feudatories. That this view of interest ripened into a positive sympathy with the industrious classes, which showed itself in many simple and natural acts of kindness, we are in no degree called upon to deny. But it is not the less true that he demoralized these very classes, first through the crooked contrivances by which he quelled their oppressors, and then still more completely by his resolution to allow them nothing like political, as distinct from municipal freedom, and thus left them at his death prepared to submit to any tyranny which the course of time might produce. It is not necessary to enumerate the various tyrannies which had raised themselves at the time we are considering upon the ruins of popular freedom in every great city of Italy, with the one exception of Venice, nor yet those which the weakness of emperors like Frederick III had allowed to begin in the various states of Germany. But the last Plantagenet reigns in England were so important as paving the way for Tudor despotism that a few words must needs be said upon them, under the guidance of the latest and most learned of our constitutional historians. The 15th century may be said to begin with the accession of the Lancastrian dynasty in 1399. As regards the points on which political writers most frequently dwell, Henry IV. and Henry V. were strongly inclined, the former from his defective title, and the latter from an innate power of influencing men as he would, to a really constitutional government. Again and again did Henry IV. Listen to the remonstrances of his parliaments, as in 1401, when they claimed that he should accept no account of their proceedings except from themselves; in 1404, when he consented on their petition to remove any counsellor distasteful to them, and in particular to dismiss all aliens from the Queen's service; in 1406, when they insisted that he should give an account of his expenditure, and dismissed the rascally crew which composed his household; and in 1407, when the Commons protested against any bill of supply originating with the Lords. Besides this, parliamentary grants to him were strictly appropriated to their intended purposes, a restriction which we are inclined to consider an improvement of modern times, and one to which even Cromwell as Protector was unwilling to submit. The parliaments of Henry V. were naturally compliant, from the overflowing favour with which a war in France was regarded, whereas Comines repeatedly notes, "Every Englishman made sure of enriching himself by plunder and the ransom of captives." Thus, in 1417 and 1419, large subsidies were willingly paid. When, however, they did make remonstrances, he was, like his father, always ready to attend, as when they prayed in 1414 that there be never no law made, on their petition, and engrossed as statute and law, neither by addition nor diminution, by no manner of term, which shall change the sentence and the intent asked, a point which was to come out as a memorable occasion in after time. As to the safety for life under these sovereigns, it cannot be called unsatisfactory, except as regards, first, the exercise of martial law in wartime, and secondly, the effective statutes coming from Parliament itself. It has been well said that in beheading Scroop and Mowbray in 1405, and the Southampton conspirators in 1415, Henry IV. And his son were sowing the wind that their dynasty might reap the whirlwind, inasmuch as from these precedents sprang the practice so universal in the Wars of the Roses of putting the captured leaders to death after each battle, either by a mere order or by the sentence of such men as Montague or Tiptoft, who tried prisoners summarily and plainly, without any noise and show of judgment, and sometimes according to the law of some foreign state where the judge had received his university education. As for the barbarous executions which follow the statute de haeretico comburendo, these, of course, were not technically acts of royal tyranny, since the authority for them was parliamentary, and grounded on a belief which, though in itself both cruel and stupid, had yet darkened all counsel ever since the days when it misled the strong intellect of Augustine. Here, accordingly, the state, the crown, and above all the church, had to share the terrible responsibility among them. There was, therefore, under the early Lancastrian kings some ground for the admiration of England as contrasted with France, which is expressed alike by Philippe de Comines and by the English Fortescue, whom Comines may have seen during his exile in France. Under these kings we really had what Fortescue calls a dominium regali et politicum. They would not have ventured, as Edward III. Did, to assent to a petition of Parliament, and then a few weeks later to rescind the act by their own authority on the ground that they had dissimulated, never having really intended to grant it. But a woeful change came over England with the accession of the House of York. First, the Privy Council began to assume the powers which made it such a terrible engine of oppression under Henry VII. And his successors. This body really had from Parliament a standing authority, to be exercised, however, under strict supervision, by which they could suspend the execution of various important statutes. In pecuniary matters they were authorized, in case of emergency, to pledge, up to a certain limited amount, the credit of the kingdom, a practice which Comines seems to have had in mind when he says that in his judgment such emergencies as make it really necessary for kings to collect money more quickly than by the normal processes of law hardly ever occur. As the king had long ceased to judge in person, and the council was considered chiefly as his substitute, its members could not actually try cases, but to examine men before trial when suspected of treason, and to rack them for the purpose of extracting evidence, appears, in spite of Fortescue's declaration that torture was unknown to the English law, to have been thought within the royal prerogative, and therefore within the competence of the council. The first registered instances of such torture are in 1468 under Edward IV, when more than one of Queen Margaret's messengers were burned in the feet or racked to make them discover their accomplices. The jurisdiction of the constable under which Tiptoft and Montague acted, the latter even impaling prisoners after death, was part of the same bad system. Edward IV also introduced the system of perpetual forfeitures for treason. Before his time, restoration after a period of eclipse had been the understood rule. He set this principle absolutely at naught by bestowing the Percy earldom on a Neville, and that of Pembroke on a Herbert. When we add to these changes the well-known extension in Edward's reign of the system of benevolences and forced loans, the extreme infrequency of parliaments, and the trivial character of the business which they were allowed to take in hand, together with the frequent executions of those whom the king feared, including his own brother, the Duke of Clarence, we shall readily understand what a vast breach in the constitution this reign really made, a breach which the reign of Richard III, inclined as he naturally was to support the weakness of his title and to put his crimes out of remembrance by popular concessions, was much too short to repair, especially as his necessities after a while drove him to collect money by methods hardly differing from the illegal ones which he had professed to abolish. Accordingly, Henry VII, on succeeding to the crown, found himself very slightly fettered by constitutional precedents, and would doubtless have been a violently oppressive governor if he had not been far more inclined to the sort of chicane natural to one whose early life had been passed in avoiding dangers, and who, in many things, kept before his eyes the example of Louis XI. He thoroughly realized that to govern as he chose, two main conditions were required. He must need few or no subsidies, and he must avoid the foreign wars which would make subsidies indispensable, and which might also raise up competitors for the crown. Such, then, was the starting point of the prince who was to inaugurate more than 100 years of autocratic government in England, and by keeping these two principles constantly in view, he gave a new political character to the century which followed his accession, which it will in the following chapters be our business to trace. End of Section 1.